Europe is ancient, and the blood of the people who live there runs deep, into the very foundations of prehistory. First, the farmers came and made their mark. Then they were displaced by the iron-wielding horsemen of the Indo-Aryans. Still, some of these original peoples stubbornly prevailed in Europe. The sun rises upon one such group on the 1st of October, 304 BC. It alights a small, settled tribe that calls itself Avariginia, a tribe of the Iberic faith living in the middle of the North Iberian coast, ruled over by a woman named Indicida, first to hold the position of chief after the death of her father, and the earliest recorded sovereign of this people. Under her, they lived as they had for generations. They fished the rich waters of the Atlantic, and as such were sailing folk. They worshipped their ancient and forgotten gods, and honored their dead by excarnation of the bones, followed shortly thereafter by a cenotaph grave for the deceased. And so was the chieftess' father honored. His bones were picked clean on the holy hill by birds of prey, and his bones were interred in a grave mound containing many of his treasures. Upon her ascension, she weaved a banner for her people, an 8-spoked wheel of white on a field of black. This represented all the directions of the world, and the places the seafaring Avarigines could reach by sea. This resonated with the tribe, and quickly became a symbol of heritage and unity for the people. As her first orders as chieftess, Similchi used the sworn warriors of her tribe to collect taxes, so as to increase the power of her seat, and used this to establish primitive shipyards along the coast. In November, she fell with child, and during that pregnancy was struck by a dream. This dream was of her on a ship, filled with terrified, starving people, when it was attacked by a monumental squid. Instead of cowering, she went to the tentacles that threatened to sink them and cut them off, feeding them to the terrified passengers. When she woke and spoke to the learned men, she understood that the very things which surround the tribe and threaten its existence could also very well be its nourishment. In short, it was a call to war. As a result, that same month, Similchi consulted the council on the matter of Galicia. The region had long been laid claim to by her people, and also widely by people of her culture, consisting of what would one day be called Pre-Indo-Europeans. Celtic peoples had, in the intervening eons, taken most of the region, and Similchi endeavored to get it back. A deal was struck with the tribe of Conclave, wherein an alliance would be maintained. In June of 303, an alliance was established with the Avariginia tribe as well. A son, named Fralgar, was born to Similchi on the 1st of August 303. Meanwhile, after a full year of deliberation and consulting the cenotaph grave mound of Similchi's father, it was finally ordained on the 19th of November that Galicia must belong to Avariginia, and from thenceforth a policy of advancing that goal would be pursued in earnest. That same day, war was declared on the tribe of Organomeschia, which controlled that region. They called their ally, the tribe of Vidinia, into the war on their side. Meanwhile, Bruggensium and Avariginia honored the alliance and aided chieftess Similchi in her war. By the 23rd of September 302, the siege of Palontion was won, in which those days consisted of overcoming Motte and Bailey fortresses, or simply surrounding them and waiting. Soon thereafter, the Battle of Equasera was also swiftly concluded. The honored sons of Avariginia were more than enough to win the fight. The Second Battle of Equasera saw 5,000 Vadine men go up against 5,000 Avarigines and lose. Equasera was occupied in October, and the Battle of Camarica in November would precede the siege of the Vidanian capital, the deadliest of the war yet. Warfare in those days was primal, consisting of an impassioned mob on both sides, wielding crude iron and sometimes bronze weapons, seeking personal glory in combat and occasionally glory in death. These same 5,000 men went on to besiege the enemy settlement for over a year, and through brutal conditions, attained victory. As the elite families of Organomeschia and Vidinia were put to death before the cheering crowds in the home capital of Caelum, Similchi suddenly became wildly popular. Caelum wasn't much of a capital by later standards, so much as a settlement like any other which held particular significance to the people regardless. Meanwhile, the story of the 5,000 Evergines became almost mythic, and would be passed down through generations as the moment that Avariginia began its journey towards greatness. This expansion, however, did not come without a price. The local economy began to suffer, and it became clear that a standing army was not a realistic possibility. And so, 2,000 men were sent home in order to support their families and work the fields. Meanwhile, out in the world, things were beginning to change. The ambitious Mediterranean republic called Rome had conquered its southern neighbor Etruria, the Seleucid Empire expanded east, and Judea broke away from the influence of Phrygia, which was itself expanding to the north. In December of 293 BC, Similchi called upon the god Decretius, said to be a patron of the economy, for stability and income, which leads to prosperity. The slaves were more productive that month, and tribute was thusly rendered, introducing foreign gods into local worship. Regardless, this long period of inactivity would continue until the Evergine financial house was in order. A second son, named Ambon, was born to Similchi on the 20th of April 292. A third son was then born to Similchi on the 22nd of February 283, named Lagunas. The economy continued to stagnate, which was perhaps not surprising for a minor settled tribe. For a brief period in November of 278, Avariginia experienced a temporary surplus. Similchi took this as a sign of the god's favor and declared war on the tribe of Cyllenia, immediately to the west, hoping that the acquisition of their territory would bring fresh taxes into the tribal economy. Cyllenia called upon their fellow Celts, and the Lanciensia and Tiburia tribes came to Cylenia's aid, while Avariginia called upon Autogonia and Cancania yet again. In September of 276, a daughter was born to Similchi named Aunia. The war was difficult, and by January of 273, Avariginia was on the losing side of it. Luckily, the stimulation of war had revived the economy somewhat via the gains of plunder, and Similchi immediately used this sudden surplus to raise thousands of more men for the fight. This turned the war, but it also turned the treasure hoard to ruin. A deal was struck, and two provinces, Lancia and Comeniaca, were ceded to Avariginia. Desperate to complete her conquest, Similchi declared war again, this time paying for mercenaries and foregoing the support of her allies entirely. By 263, the 16,000 mercenaries had to be let go, but by then the war was already essentially over. The treasure hoard, or treasury as it was sometimes called, grew smaller by the day, and it was crucial that Similchi complete her war as soon as possible in order to attain victory. On the 13th of August, 263, the noble families of Cyllenia were put to death, and the economy began to recover after that hard-won conflict. Meanwhile, elsewhere in Europe, Carthage was climbing its way up Hispania, and the Seleucids began settling Arabia in search of incense, and Xanthia was using its Scythian cavalry to devastating effect, subjugating many of its immediate neighbors. Around 260 BC, regular sacrifices were made to Melkart, the Canaanite god of prosperity, as introduced by the now local Carthaginians. This increased the motivation of the merchants, who brought home much-needed trade and revenue from abroad. Similchi, now 61, finally found her tribe in a stable place. Funded, expanded, and above all at peace, Avariginia was resplendent. In 258, the general Andoboles restructured the military to reflect merit instead of birth, and to reduce the emphasis on personal glory, drilling his men in formations and strategic combat, which he learned from the manuscripts of Greek merchants. Meanwhile, the Celtic nation of Duniquia began distinct expansion during this period, in response to the threat posed by the encroaching Carthaginians. On the 25th of May, 253, chieftess Similchi Indicida developed cancer. Desiring one final capstone to her reign, chieftess Similchi endeavored to conquer Lugonia and Paeschkia. In 249, she called upon the blessings of Candamius, the Iberic deity of war, for favor in combat, increasing the morale of her soldiers at the site. On the 12th of April, Similchi embarked on her final conquest. 5,000 Avarigines set out into Lugonia as a forward invasion force, but were repelled, and the northwestern provinces were then occupied by Lugonian warriors. Luckily, Conclave men came to support the counterattack in the north, while Altragonia pushed up through enemy territory from the south. On the 13th of February, 248 BC, Avarigine and Altragine forces took the Lugonian capital of Lucus Austurum, while Lugonian forces took Utaris, the westernmost Avarigine settlement. On the 28th of September, Similchi hired 17,000 mercenaries to complement her own 5,000-man war host, and invaded Lugonia in the west. What resulted was the largest battle on record in the region. 23,000 Avarigines and 10,700 Paesci locked in mortal combat. The Avarigine general, Becelianus Iacus, relied on the aligned shields and spears of his men to create proper formations and outclass the Paesci army, while the Paesci general, Cartorites Morganus, used flanking maneuvers and his men's broad swords to cleave through the newly regimented Avarigine ranks. Ultimately, the day was won, and the war began to turn in favor of Avariginia and her allies. On the 29th of March, 246 BC, Avariginia had conquered the desired lands, the foreign Celtic nobles were executed, and Similchi had obtained her final conquest. She emptied the treasury a third time trying to do this, but the people didn't care. She brought glory to them and honor to their name. She would live out the rest of her days in peace and calmly look over her people's tribal lands. In June, several trade deals were made with her allies to the east, and the pockets of the state were once again replenished. This was one of the best times to be an Avarigine that they could remember. Meanwhile, to the south, things were not so peaceful. Duniquia was laid low by Carthage, and as such they continued to lurch closer, like a fire in a field. On the 29th of August, 246 BC, Similchi Indicida succumbed to her cancer and died at the astounding age of 76. She concluded a storied life, and one which was apparently worth recording for the first time, in a chronicle written by local priests in the Greek tongue. Her reign and her actions during that reign brought her people out of their obscure somnolescence and onto a path which history would record. They were awake, and as such they had graduated into the historical record. She was a decidedly hard woman to replace. The clan chiefs deliberated for a long while after her death, but eventually settled on the 59-year-old Aratunin Nisuna as the new chieftess. Now, many people were dissatisfied at this, hoping a Fralgar, son of Similchi, would become the new chief. So, upon assuming her new role, Aratunin had to deal with a fair bit of resistance. Regardless, the clan chiefs sensed a wisdom and level-headedness in this woman that many others lacked, and thus she became the second recorded chieftain, and the first one whose reign is attested to from start to finish in the archaeological record. Anchored in reality, Avariginia trusted its new captain to steer it towards the bright future and a bountiful legacy. But could she live up to Similchi, who emerged fully formed from the age of myth and heroes?